Let's talk about loops in this video. Sometimes we want to run some piece of code multiple times. At that time, we can either write the same statement multiple times, but that will be repetitive and very boring. If we want to make change to one of the places, we have to make changes to all the code section. But in order to repeat the same steps multiple times, we can use an inbuilt construct. Here comes the loops. Loops allow us to repeat the same piece of code multiple times. There are two types of loops in Python. There is while loop and there are for loops. We will understand them in this video. So while loop looks like this. First of all, we initialize some kind of iterator. Then inside the while statement, we check some condition. And this creates a block. Inside this block, we can write all the statements that we want to repeat multiple times. As long as this condition holds true, all the statements will be executed. Once this condition becomes false, the while loop ends and the execution flows further. So let's look at practical example. First of all, I initialize the iterator I equals 0. Now I want to iterate up to 5 number. So I want to print first 5 numbers. So in the condition, I can write something like this, while I less than 5. As long as it's less than 5, I want to print that number. And I also have to make sure that I increment the number so that this condition eventually becomes false. So I write I plus equals 1. If I run this code, you can see that it prints 0 to 4. If I by mistake remove this I plus equals 1, then let's see what happens. You can see that it repetitively prints 0. Because I is never incremented, i's value remains 0. And 0 is always less than 5, so this condition never becomes false. This is something known as infinite loop. You will have to be careful with while loop. You have to make sure that this condition eventually becomes false. Now while loops are mostly used when we don't know exactly when the loop should end. For example, if we are taking user input, and we want to quit the collection of user input when the user enters quit or exit. In those kinds of situations, we don't know exactly when the user will enter quit. So those cases can be implemented using while loops. So let's look at simple example. Here I'm taking user input and as a prompt I'm writing enter your choice. Now in the while loop, I can write a condition like this. User input dot lower is not equal to quit. So as long as user doesn't enter quit, this loop is going to keep running. And inside the loop, I write user input equals input. Sorry, you are wrong, guess again. So if I run this piece of code, you can see that it asks for my user input. If I enter hi, it says, sorry, you are wrong, guess again. Let's enter hello. And again, it prompts me to enter another input. If I enter quit, then the loop exits. So this way, while loops can be used when we don't know exactly when the loop should end. Now, unlike other programming languages, we can also add an else block to the while loop. So here, I can write else, print, you got it right. If I run this and enter hello, it asks me for the prompt again, but if I enter quit, you can see that it prints you got it right. So that way, this else block is executed when this condition becomes false. In Python, there is another loop called for loop. For loop is very easy and it's used mostly to loop through any kind of sequence. Sequence is collection of other data type. For example, strings are sequence of characters. Its syntax looks like this. For item in sequence, then we have this colon and it creates a block. All the statements inside this block will be executed as a part of this for loop. As long as we have some item from the sequence, it will keep running this loop. So let's take a simple example with a string. If I create a variable with a value hello, now this hello is a sequence of characters, so I can iterate through it. For character in this string, print character. If I run this piece of code, you can see that it prints all the characters from this string. In Python, there is a special function called range. It actually represents an immutable sequence of numbers in the form of range object. This is used to iterate specific number of times through a piece of code. We can use the range function like this. We can specify the start position, the end position, and the steps we want to increment by. So let's look at simple example. If I write range 1, 5, here 1 means the starting position and 5 means the end position. This will actually return range from 1 to 4. The last digit is not included. If I check the type for this range object, you can see that it returns range class. So let's see how we can use it. We can use it in for loops. I can write something like this. For number in range 5, if I don't specify the start position, it by default takes 0 as the starting position. So this range 5 will create range object from 0 to 4. Inside this loop, I simply print the number. If I run this, you can see that it prints 0 to 4. The last digit is not included in the range object. If I write for number in range 4 to 9, print number, then in that case, it prints numbers from 4 to 8. I can also include the step position. By default, this step value is 1. So if I write for number in range 0, 10 and 1, here this 1 means the step I want to increment by, and inside the loop I print the number, then it prints 0 to 9. If I modify this step value to let's say 2, then it will print all the value from 0 to 10 which are even. So it will print 0, then it increments the number by 2, so it will print 2, 4, 6 and onwards. If we want to iterate in the reverse order, we can specify the step as negative value. So in that case, we want to start from 10 and want to go up to 1. So I can write for number in range, the starting position is 10 and end position is 0, and I want to increment by negative 1. So this way it will go 10, 9, 8 and so on. Let's print the number and let's verify. You can see that it prints the sequence in the reverse order. Now in for loop, just like while loop, we can also have an else block. So I can write something like for I in range 3, 0, negative 1, print I. So this will count down the number 3, 2, 1, and finally in the else block I can write print go. So it prints like a countdown of a racing game. Now in Python, there is break keyword. It can be useful to exit your loop based on some kind of condition. So let's take an example of this. Earlier we wrote while loop to exit when the user enters quit. We could implement the same thing using break statement. So here I write while loop, while true, this condition will always be true. User input equals input. Can you guess the word? When the user enters queue or quit, that's when we want to exit the loop. So here I can write a condition if user input equals queue or user input equals quit. If that's the case, then we can write, you guessed it right, and break. So when this condition holds true, the execution goes inside this block, and when Python encounters break statement, it will exit the outer loop. So it will exit the while loop even though the condition was never false. Inside the else block, I can write, no, that's not what I thought. Guess again. So it will prompt the user to guess again. Let's run this code. So it gives me this input box. Let's enter guess. And it says, no, that's not what I thought. Guess again. Let's enter help. Again, it gives me new input prompt to guess again. If I enter quit, then it says, you guessed it right. So that way we can utilize this break statement to exit the loop prematurely. Similarly, when you are writing a loop and you want to skip only few occurrences of events based on some condition, then in that case we can use continue statement. Continue is kind of opposite of break statement. It will not exit the loop, but it will skip that particular iteration. So let's take an example. For example, we are iterating through 0 to 9 and we want to skip some execution only for numbers 5 and 7. So in that case, we can use the continue statement. I can write for I in range 10, print I. If I run this, it will simply print 0 to 9. But I want to skip the execution when the number is 5 or 7. So inside this block, I can write condition if I equals 5 or I equals 7. Then in that case, I want to skip the iteration, so I can write continue. If I run this, you can see that it prints 0 to 9, but it has skipped 5 and 7. So this way, this continue statement can be used to skip specific iterations